Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 2 of Practitioners Unplugged. Today, we have some special guests that are going to take us through their transformation journey. With me, as always, is Shri. Shri, what do we have in store today?
Hey, Dante. So on our first episode, we talked about the importance of anchoring the data management strategy to the business strategy. One of the reasons for this critical alignment is that we have a very messy multi-vendor data landscape. It can be daunting, it can be overwhelming. So the business and the operational priorities should drive the data management evolution and the roadmap. So in this ideal, let's say, exchange between the business and the technical side and the ongoing collaboration, I'm excited to bring on board Bram Vangenabet and David Ariens, because they are a great model of collaborators in this digital transformation journey. So let's bring them on board and then let's get to know them.
Welcome, Bram and David. Bram, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself real quickly?
Yeah,
a little bit about your
sure.
background, what you're doing today, what you have been doing.
Thanks for the introduction. A little bit about myself. I'm a chemical engineer as background, and I'd say for the last 14 years, I've been working in several functions in digital manufacturing. Started out in oil and gas and chemicals, mostly really on the operational side, working with DCS systems, PLCs, running the controls of a refinery. I had my first exposure as well to predictive modeling. Then I went for a while into consulting to explore different sectors, mostly still oil and gas, chemicals, energy, where I really specialized in predictive modeling. And for the last 9 years, I've been working for Barry Callebaut in the food industry, really working on a project to help them digitally transform, starting from, I would say, a very limited data availability landscape to where they are today, having a standardized data collection platform deployed in more than 160 production lines worldwide. And with this comes also, I would say, a new start, a new chapter for me, because next week I'm beginning a completely new role as an independent consultant with a first engagement for a big player in food as well, for a large bakery group in Belgium.
Seems like you have quite the background there, and we're excited to learn more. The cool thing is you go across many different industries, so we're going to get some good snippets out of this. David, you want to go ahead and take a couple minutes and introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So yes, I'm David. I'm a mathematical engineer by training. So I know all about differential equations and AI and all these things. But please don't ask me to solve an equation any longer, because I haven't touched them for quite a number of years. I started at BASF, a chemical company, back in 2010. First as a data scientist, and then later I was actually, that's in 2012, I started using Aviva, or back then Wonderware software, when I introduced paperless inspection rounds for operators, moved over to industrial cybersecurity. And then at the end of my career, I was responsible for the industrial digitalization group in Antwerp, which is still their second largest site. And then a little over 2 years ago, I switched sites. I switched to the dark side, so to say. So from a client to supplier. So I started working for Aviva Select Benelux, which is a local Aviva distributor. I'm running their data and data platform business called Analytics for Industry. And besides that, and that's something I'm really, really excited about, a year ago, I started a blog called The ITOT Insider. And on that blog, I'm writing about cultural things around ITOT convergence, around data platforms, change management, and so on.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the introduction. So without further ado, let's kind of dive in here, and I'll pass it off to Shri. Shri, you want to open it up for your first question?
Yeah. So, both our guests have, given their journey. what is your take on the manufacturing data problem? I've described it as a mess. Would you agree? Perhaps, David, you can go first.
Well, actually, the more I think about it, the more I think about where we are right now. So we talk about IT/OT convergence. Now, we actually been talking about IT/OT convergence for more than 10 years. And in the beginning, this was actually, when we talked about IT/OT convergence, we actually meant, in my opinion, infrastructure convergence, somehow connecting the wire, making sure that a local SCADA system, a local PLC was able to talk to another system somewhere. When I would say now, with the advent of AI, with data becoming more and more commodity, with IT teams also taking over a lot of these data-driven or these data-related problems, I see IT/OT convergence today primarily as data convergence. How do we make sure that data which gets generated on the shop floor somehow makes its way into the enterprise systems, into the cloud systems everybody is using, and that's not an easy task.
Absolutely. So, Bram, any thoughts to add there from your point of view on your journey?
Well, I would say a reflection that I've been having is that digital transformation has always been a topic that was very interested, but I think in the last years a lot has changed. Well, at the beginning we had to often I would say fight more to get budgets approved for digital solutions in manufacturing. I think now the priorities have changed completely, and it's because I think due to some supply chain disruptions and recent events in the last, basically since the start of the 2020s, a lot has happened. And I would say boardrooms start to realize more and more that there's a lot of potential in with data coming from manufacturing, but the challenges, they're enormous. I would say, looking at the biggest one, I would say is there's the change management challenge, which we can zoom on it later on, but I think that's something that initially in my journey, I think I underestimated, and it's so incredibly important to invest time and resources to really do this change management right while keeping the factories up and running. I think the other big one is data availability, especially for manufacturing. There's a lot of predictive models now available, which if you have the data, you can really find a lot of opportunities for improvement. But the challenge is exactly with getting that reliable data available.
So, Bram, take us behind the scenes here at the journey and experience at Barry Callebaut.
Yeah, it's really a long journey, but to kind of condense it a little bit, I joined Barry Callebaut around 2015 in a context where the company was really on the verge of starting a very ambitious digital transformation program. It was kind of initiated from our chief operating officer with the ambition to fully digitally transform our manufacturing operations. And so we have these classic deliverables that you see in other MES projects, ultimately aiming us to go fully paperless and really addressing a lot of the challenges we had around productivity increase. So think about your OEE improvement, process improvements, going after the quality, getting a full real-time digital traceability, and so on. So really the expectations of the project were huge. And that was in a context because when I initially joined the company, I just came out of the chemical industry, oil and gas, where having historians and like doing this predictive modeling based out of, the data sets that you had available. That was kind of my first question I asked, like, hey guys, can you give me access to your historian? I'd like to better understand how this chocolate making process and this cocoa bean handling, how does that work? But I got a lot of confused stares and looks where people were like, historians, what are you talking about? Go grab your camera and take a picture of the SCADA screen, and you can use those trends to understand and learn of the process, no problem. But historians, we don't do that around here. And so in that context, it was kind of clear that where they want to be, I think the completeness of vision was excellent, but the starting point was really sort of in a very manual operating environment, very much paper driven. And so that's the context where we began. Initially I was quite limited involved in the project until one of our project managers, the one leading the pilot site in the US, because we had 2 pilots, one in France, one in the US. And I kind of was involved in functional requirement definitions and somewhat helping out with like the energy module, energy optimization. When this guy resigned, I told to my manager, like, hey, I'm very interested to take over the project. Now, at that time, the project started to get its first challenges. Like the first test results weren't as good as we expected them to be. There were the first cracks in the relationship with the vendor as new change requests kept popping up. You know how that goes in these kind of projects. And actually on those changes, that was a big issue as well, because Barry Callebaut is this company that has grown through many mergers and acquisitions. And the result of that is that there's a lot of different machines, a lot of different work processes, especially if you go overseas and you compare the way of work in one factory against the other. And the ambition was to make one template that really would fit all the exceptions and all the different needs. And so you can imagine that the scope of the project was creeping, becoming more complicated and larger. And it's in that setting that kind of the project started and kicked off. And then fast forward to today, I think we've come across a lot of challenges. Like really, when I try to cluster them, it's always around these 4 key domains. I mean, there's this people, process, technology, and data. And if you look in all 4 of those topics, we've had our fair share of challenges. So like when I talk about people, it's about how do you make sure that like these applications actually get adopted by the operators, that people start using it? How do you make people work together in an efficient way? So that's one big domain. The other one is on the process side. I mean, I've already talked about this exception handling. How do you make sure that you build a solution, a template that can kind of deal with your template? I mean, this is saying don't automate a broken process. But I think that's exactly what we initially tried to do. And then there's the obvious technology challenge. So it's making sure that this new solution that has to interface with automation, with your ERP system, with all sorts of other data sets as well, to make that all work well together. And then you start to deal with the actual, like once you get the data available, you start to deal with how do you manage that? How do you make sense of it? How do you create data ownership? How do you ensure the data quality is right? So all of these things kind of came together, and it took us a pretty long time and a lot of hardship and challenges to get to the point that we had a template that was really starting to deliver value and that is now deployed at more or less 160 factory production lines worldwide.
Now, Bram, when you're working through some of these challenges, how did you start at one plant? Were you starting at multiple plants? What did that initial starting point look at? And then what did you actually start with, right? And how did you say that, hey, this is returning value? How are you getting stakeholders convinced that what you were doing was the right thing to move the needle for the business?
Yeah, so basically we started out with 2 pilot factories, 2 very different processes in different geographical regions, with the idea to span as much as possible of the different processes that go about in the global landscape. But they weren't the biggest factories as well, to kind of make the change manageable. And I would say those 2 pilots, we tried to solve a lot of problems, probably too much problems at once. So those pilots, they didn't go very well. There were a lot of moments where the project was just like one decision away from being terminated. But at the end of the day, we did manage to keep them alive. And I'm very happy we managed to get to that point, because we've learned so much from those initial pilots. And then once we went there, we kind of sat back and say, hey, okay, let's take a look at all the things that went wrong now and all the challenges we had. And we were fortunate enough to have a COO at the time that was also very much forward looking and helping to think with us, like, how do we redesign our strategy? And after that, we basically looked at much smaller scale, using some elements from the template we already had to build very small proof of concepts and to start developing a template that was much more focused on the automation layer, taking a bit away the complexity of solving those 2 interfaces at once. And after a number of smaller pilots in also factories closer to home, we went out and did a new pilot, which was on our factory in Poland. Now that's a whole different factory. It's a lot more, a lot newer. So it's a factory where all the production lines were running all on like S7 PLCs, more standardized. Connectivity was much less of an issue. Also, the factory was a little bit less strained in terms of resources, so we had people available to help us with the change management in a more engaged way. And so, the elements were much better to kind of build a template that was also much more focused around the value drivers where we had seen in the earlier POCs. Where does this solution actually help us to uncover some improvements? So that was really the first factory that we started to get scale with this renew template. And it's that we then further rolled out across the globe. So that's currently still ongoing, but it's going now at a much faster pace. And we're also building on that standardized template to add additional functionalities, additional complexity. So it's I would say a much more like using the elements from agile product development have been applied more now to this manufacturing landscape.
So it seems like from going through that pain of the pilot, you're able to kind of figure out what's that digital core, that template that we need. And then once that's kind of established, it's bringing value. You're then able to assess the rest of your organization to figure out where they are as far as data availability, data connectivity. So the path to value is a lot quicker. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely. And it's of course in part having gone through a first iteration, like, making the data available, going through all the types of challenges we had, we've been able to learn from what works, but also what doesn't work. So I would say, it's kind of strange to say, but you have to go almost through this kind of difficult project and encounter all the challenges to really learn and experience what is there. I mean, I would have loved to have somebody from our contractor or integrator to kind of point out to us like, hey, what you're doing there, maybe you should do that differently. But the reality is that actually they just, when we asked a new function or a change to be implemented, we're the customer, right? So they have to listen. But ultimately, I think that's part of the key. You need to have that experience to really know what works and what doesn't. There's this saying, you should do an MES project. Ideally, you should have 2 times. And that's exactly what we did. And I would say the first time really reinforced everything that we did going further.
So, David, when did you guys enter the picture, and what was the perspective from your end?
Well, of course, when I joined Aviva Select, the project was already ongoing for quite some years at Barry Callebaut, and at that point in time, Bram was for me just one of those rising stars. Where I saw his presentation in San Francisco and these types of things. But when we started talking more, I would say directly to each other, we quickly figured out that the stuff we encounter, the stuff Bram encountered at Barry Callebaut, the stuff I encountered at BASF, and I'm now also encountering at other customers, it's always kind of the same. There is not really I would say every company has their own specifics and their own style of management and their own people and their own very little specific processes. But when you take one step back, we actually encounter the same type of problems. The people problem is something every company faces. Like management style is something which is really interesting. Bram told that his COO, he kind of accepted the project. He saw that the project was going totally sideways, but he kind of accepted that there was another way of dealing with it. And I see too many leaders applying very old management principles to these new types of problems. We can't engineer an MES project or a data project the same way we engineer a manufacturing line. If we're engineering a manufacturing line, then we know what we're going to build. We know exactly the size. If it has a conveyor belt, we know the speed. If it has an oven, we know the temperature settings and whatever. But when we are designing a digital project, we need this I would say, fail fast type of approach. We need to accept that we don't know exactly how we're going to do something, but we do know where I would say, want to head towards. So we need a management style, people in the management who accept this way of, I would say, forward thinking. Now, another thing which I also found very interesting, is this scaling thing. Bram mentioned that one of the things which is really important is to think about how can we scale beyond the pilot phase. So we do a pilot left, I would say, in the USA plant, and it does a pilot in another plant. But how do you scale beyond pilot phase? And scaling, in my opinion, is one of the most important, or the most even underrated, or underestimated, whatever you want to call it, things in the manufacturing industry, or especially in digitalization, is how do we build a platform which is able to grow from 1 to 2 to 10 to 100 use cases in a very simple way. And to do that, we need a kind of a unification approach. We need to somehow have a layer, a platform, where we are able to, on the one hand, on the OT layer, we have to accept different systems. We have to accept different naming conventions. We have to accept that the fact that many industries are mergers and acquisitions, like Barry Callebaut. So maybe today we're all installing PLC brand A, but tomorrow we buy another company, or we have PLC brands Y and Z all of a sudden. So we need to have some unification layer, and to be able to build small applications on top of that, which are easy to scale out. Does that somehow make sense for you?
Yeah, it does. So let me introduce the notion of, when we look across many of these journeys, some kind of a crawl, walk, run framework. Because it seems like the crawl phase is very much like, getting into it, getting your fingernails dirty, assessing things, and, tackling a lot of the messiness that you find. I'm interested to hear, Bram's perspective on, because in this crawl phase, it's so vital to have that management support still doing, understanding that a lot of mess has to be cleaned up, right? Because in terms of delivering the value of the business transformation goals or whatever, you need to get your head above water, so to speak, right? What are your thoughts on that, Bram?
Well, I would say crawl, walk, run. It's an interesting analogy because it's almost like, it almost feels like we're trying to do a lot of those phases at the same time. Like at the beginning of the project, you kind of need a strategy, and to have a strategy, you need to have your completeness of vision. So it's almost like you want to know what it is like to run, and to have a very clear picture of that. And it's so important, because later on, if you want to scale the solution, you kind of want to know already where you're going to end up with. And that's where standardization comes in the picture. Like one concrete example is, in the very beginning, we knew we wanted to have a global template that we could use on multiple factories. So we set out and defined, let's say, a naming convention to really define how are we going to call the different data points. That's a big benefit we had. It's kind of a greenfield environment, so we could deploy the same standard on all of the factories. So that's something which takes a lot of time to set that up. And that doesn't really bring an immediate value, but it's so important to have those standards. But then once you start to actually implement, you also need your standards to marry with pragmatism. Because if you try to adhere to the standards too religiously, then at one point you also start to like run in circles and lose the focus. And the focus, it's about value. And so what is needed, and then we go really into the crawl phase. We're starting to invest a lot of money into new solutions, new technologies. And the value that's being delivered is kind of the fuel that keeps the fire burning, that keeps the project moving forward. So you need to kind of find your early success cases. So once you start to have some data available, and you're going quite broad in having to get the first data point in, you need to have connectivity with your PLCs. You need to get your platform set up. So this initial setup is quite cumbersome. But once you have that up and running, then you really need to start and narrow down. Like what we did, we saw that there was a lot of demand for operational efficiency improvement. Like we didn't have a standardized solution. The definition was different in every factory. And so starting to focus really on that small piece of the value problem helped us to uncover some really nice improvements. And then that was the first trigger. Like you crawl, you have your first use case, nice, everybody happy. And then the second thing, it's the walk part, is when we started to deploy that same template across multiple sites. So this was after the initial pilots, and we had our simplified template. And then you start to reach a point where the same solution is applied in the second, the third, the fourth factory. And you start to get this first scaling effect where people in the different factories start to talk to each other. Big part of change management is facilitating that communication. And then you start to see, hey, this benefit that we promised would be delivered, we can actually use that in more than one site. And then you start to really get the view like, hey, but we actually are able to deliver this value at scale. And then you are getting into the run phase. That's when executive management comes in and say, hey, you have this solution. Why are you not scaling that faster? Like, what do you need to deliver that solution on all of the factories? And then you say, okay, yeah, we have budget issues, there is some regional differences and so on. But that's when you start to get you to switch from like really a push mode, like, hey, I have a solution that can solve your problems. Do you want it? To, come on, I want this solution really fast, deliver it to me. And so all of this really needs to come together. So you really need to start with a completeness of vision to say, hey, there's this value here. And at the end of the day, the value is always going to be linked to an ambitious goal related to your EBIT. I mean, that's what keeps companies running. It's another form of sustainability, if you want, to keep manufacturing productive in the future. And then it's really starting small, getting some benefits out there. And as you come along and start to have your first successes, to be able to scale. But if you haven't thought about scaling from the beginning, you're going to end somewhere dead in the tracks.
So I think that's all a good point, right? So I want to go back because I heard a couple of things, the change management and a little bit about overcoming technical debt within that discussion. So it seemed like you were cleaning a little bit of data with the standard naming conventions and things like that, moving to like that pilot phase. And then it almost appeared that when everybody was like, hey, why aren't you scaling? It's because I don't have the resources, to overcome this technical debt. So do you feel that, once you have these successes into the beginning, the investments to overcoming some of that technical debt become more available from a leadership perspective? Or how did you start to, overcome some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the technical debt, I mean, there's many dimensions of technical debt, but I think a big one in manufacturing is that a company like Barry Callebaut has grown over many years through some mergers and acquisitions and building a lot of new production lines. And what's key and center when you build a new production line, it's very capex intensive. So there is a big drive in minimizing those costs. And so when it's about adding sensors, adding measurement devices, PLC connectivity, that's usually not a priority for this sort of projects. And that's where you start building this technical debt, because then comes the day that you want to go to fully automatic production, autonomous traceability, autonomous production lines, but you're still lacking sensors to, in some cases, even measure. I mean, we have some tanks where levels still have to be measured manually, right? Like somebody visually checking what's in the tank. I mean, that's an extreme case, but that's really where you start to build up that technical debt. There's the other example of very old PLCs that are no longer supported before the days that Ethernet ports were a thing. And then you start to say, hey, I want to connect to that line and read on what is the performance to also apply this to all my lines in the factory to eliminate the exceptions from the report. And that's a very capex intensive thing to solve. But what I noticed is that once your solution starts to get a certain scale and there is a willingness of people to say, hey, this value can really be applied. It's proven, we believe in it. It has been demonstrated on the lines that don't have that technical depth. And that was with us a catalyst to start investing in like, there's other reasons why you want to upgrade PLCs that are no longer supported. But MES was kind of an accelerating argument to also get rid of old S5 PLCs and invest in additional load cells and other instruments. So
I'm going to ask just two more follow-up questions to that. So when we talk about doing this, did anything change on the front end now when you're dealing with, partners? Because obviously doing a massive transformation, we can't do everything internally. Did anything change in the way that you manage maybe standards with system integrator partners or OEMs when you procure equipment to have it more like data ready? Because it seems like my experience, there's the initial cost, right, to pay for smarter equipment in the beginning, but then if I go to apply this approach later and I try to retrofit everything, that cost is like 10 times the amount because we're already producing. We can't shut systems down. Having to have people come in and retrofit all this just balloons the cost. So did anything change in that regard? And if so, what's that look like today?
yeah, absolutely. And I maybe to your point on the cost of retrofitting, I would say that's probably the single biggest hurdle that we have right now in scaling MES worldwide, because on the PLCs that we manage ourselves and where we have kind of knowledge on the operating standard, it's open and we can access and connect to the data points we need fairly easy, and that becomes almost like a repeatable process. But then you have all the machines that are there, put there by all sorts of different machine builders. And often it's sourcing selects the cheapest one, so you end up having quite a lot of different solutions out there from before the time MES was even a thing. So I think one of the things that has changed is that engineering now has a set of guidelines that they need to follow when ordering new equipments that are shared as an input from the MES team. And that took time to really, we had the standard, I think, earlier on in the process. But in the beginning, when you have maybe 5 or 6 lines deployed, that didn't really have the critical mass to change behavior in all of the regions. I think now with more than 60% of the globe, on the same solution, that creates the critical mass to make sure that when new equipments are put in place, that standard is much better adopted. So that's one thing. Where I think the holy grail sits a little bit is like you say, it indeed becomes expensive when you have to retrofit a solution. I think that is still an issue. Machine builders often are not really that busy with making, and they're even reluctant to open their code so that you can get access yourself to the data points they have in their machine. Although they do have an interest as well in their own data themselves. And I think one thing that we haven't really fully nailed is sort of coming to a more open standard, a community where machine builders, and I'm not talking only about the protocol, because there we have OPC UA, MQTT, there's really good protocols out there, but it's more about the level above that. Once you have established communication, making sure that those data points are open. I was recently reading a book from McKinsey, Rewired, where there's a really funny anecdote from what Jeff Bezos instructed at Amazon. He basically at one point sent out a memo to all of his employees to say, hey, whatever you build, whichever application that the team is working on, it always must come with an API. I don't care what language it's programmed in, but if you don't make your data accessible to the rest of the organization, you basically you will get promoted to customer, right? So I think the important takeaway for me is that we need to come to a point whenever you buy an equipment, anything that comes into the factory needs to have openness built into it. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's certainly a very important key on scaling digital transformations in manufacturing going further.
Well, there are some concepts who are getting quite some traction, right? Like, for example, unified namespace is I would say it's primarily about being open, having data flowing in some kind of a central broker, and then in many cases even publishing, I would say, metadata together with the actual process data, and then having data consumers. being it applications, being it, I would say, the end user, maybe even being it third parties actually consuming that data out of that broker. So that I would say from a concept, I do see the industry taking small steps towards such an open ecosystem.
To some extent, yes. I mean, from a technology perspective, if indeed very good solutions for unified namespace, and in a way we've used also our system platform as an environment to standardize the data points that we get into our platform. But then it's also about, like, if I go to a machine from a machine builder, it could be a checkware or anything, then the challenge often is to the machine builders. They select a number of data points to be exposed, and that's usually their decision. Whenever you need something else, or you need that data to be presented in a different format, that's when the trouble starts. And I think I don't have the solution. I think we've found different workarounds, and that workaround often is just painstakingly begging the integrator or the machine builder to just make the change in the system. But if we were able to gather more in a self-service environment to say, I need these data points, even if the vendor didn't initially select to expose them, but for you as a manufacturer, that might be a relevant data point. That's something I think we still need to crack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the unified namespace goes on top to kind of leverage that data, obviously.
And I've seen that same challenge multiple times where you're kind of OEM locked out. And then when we go out to the OEMs, they're like, hey, what do you want to use this data for? Well, we need it for OEE analysis. Well, do you want to use our cloud platform that does it? It's no, I don't want to use it. I've just invested this huge thing. I can't have all these silos, right? I don't want to turn my manufacturing floor into my iPhone where I have 60 different apps. I pay a SaaS subscription for every single one of them. So yeah, I think that community is partnering with vendors, with OEMs, and being very clear up front of what data you need and why. And I just don't think the OEMs understand kind of the transformation that's going on in the background enough, because again, they're trying to push stuff out, keep costs down. So it chicken or the egg kind of thing, but that's where we're at right now.
Absolutely. And that actually is a topic on like, vendors that offer a cloud platform. But that's where you see a lot of pilot projects to go really fast, right? There's a vendor that comes in like, hey, I have some device, you plug it on your machinery, and we will then give you, vibration analysis data or anything on that sort, where it's all handled in the cloud. And that's fine to get started and to really get to quick results. So it can be important to come to new insights. But then the problems start, because then you say, but actually I would like to use that data also in a predictive model. But then we're not really able to expose that data to you. And by the way, we also need some data from your manufacturing. So can you please send that to us? And before you know it, you're copying data to all sorts of different platforms. There's a lot of data existing in the factory that you don't have access to. And I think that's indeed, it comes down also to the question of data ownership, where, besides the fact that OEMs don't always open up their code, there's also this challenge on data platforms where before you know it, you have an even more complicated landscape to manage. And it's difficult to control those, because if you go to the operations, they're very eager and keen on trying that out, because it's cheap, relatively cheap, it's fast, so you get to some quick results. So they get exposed to a lot of sales calls on a day. So if you're then working in a global organization where you want to implement some standards where things tend to be slower, that's a very difficult field of tension to manage.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot of times, and you kind of hit the nail right. If those data sources aren't synced or data lives in different areas, now everybody's talking about AI, Gen AI, how do I do all these different things? And I have 50 different data sources, none of them are correlated. So it becomes very, very difficult to start to do some analytics at a high level. So I always push people back. There is that element of scale fast with, point cloud solutions, but is that really what you want to do? It'll help you with, industry 4.0 in the interim, but you're going to miss out on you're going to have to re-engineer everything to take advantage of AI into the near term. So yeah, definitely agree with that point 100%.
Bram, did you guys have some structure like a smart factory council, something that brought the cross-functional stakeholders together? Because it's interesting, it's just within the four walls of your organization, your hands are full herding a lot of cats, and now we go to ecosystem, there's even more cats to herd. But
Yeah, and
you need
it's
these, yeah, you need these structures, right?
yeah, it's really on the topic of governance, governance of a big project, and I would say that there's a lot of different phases in there because obviously in the beginning it's a small initiative, so the number of people it's more limited to your project steerco. And then as your deployment starts to grow, look at one point, what we did is we introduced, because we got a lot of requests from different sites. Some were kind of happy with the standard and didn't pose many exceptions, but then there were other sites that were asking 1,001, like we are special, right? So we want to have a special solution. And the question is, how do you deal with that? Because the cost of change increases a lot as your install base grows. So what we did is we created a digital change board where we had in all of our sites, as part of our digital change initiative, we created a community with change engineers sitting locally. We had a digital change lead that kind of brought everyone together. So whenever somebody had a request, they basically were able to put that request to the central, I would say, coordinator. That would kind of see what are the popular requests, what is coming back, and he would then be our liaison, talking to the more senior business leaders to kind of help to do a prioritization, and then bring that back to the technical team to make sure that we kind of had a backlog that was managed, and that was a very important tool for our governance, I would say, during the last 2-3 years. And I think now we're really more evolving into a global organization. There's a big restructuring ongoing to really bring, again, the digital operate and the operation teams closer together. So it's a big change. And I think the operating model hasn't now been fully transitioned yet, but it will certainly take over some of those elements that we were using in the past, but then again in a slightly different way. So it's something that really also the governance is a process that changes as the deployment becomes more substantial.
You know, what strikes me are the parallels to, going back 30 years, supply chain. How do you break down the walls between functional groups, create cross-functional teams, create the dialogue, get everybody on the same page? That all still, it's still relevant, right? Although the context is slightly different from a manufacturing perspective. Yeah, no, that was actually quite helpful in what others can do to again this evolution from crawl, walk, run. But to your earlier point, you still have to have some end state vision that's guiding you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the strategy, right? I mean, that really guides the decisions, and you need to have a framework within which everything fits. Because if you don't have that, you're gonna be doing some initiatives, and I would say to the point of Dante earlier, that's when you get a lot of endpoint solutions and small proof of concepts, and you might have many of those across the organization. But if you don't have sort of like a central strategy that offers a framework within which you can operate, then you're never going to be able to deliver these benefits at scale. And ultimately, that's what we do need for these solutions to work. But they also need to go hand in hand. I mean, the moment that standardization and the strategy becomes a religion, that's when you lose pragmatism. And you also can't have an organization where there's a central group dictating to the sites, like you can't make any changes. So looking at how can you support self-service and offer sites to have some degree of freedom. It's really that balance between the two that is so important for a successful scaling transformation that brings value.
Yeah, it seems like you have a lot of cross-functional collaboration too. Because if I think of MES deployments, right, we have quality, we have production and scheduling, we've got performance, we have operations management data in there, maintenance, right? Whatever you want within that context. If you don't coordinate with those cross-functional teams and you don't understand what they're doing, what information they need, it's going to lead to some challenges as well, because you're just going to give, I think this is what you need versus, hey, how are you actually running your business at the production floor level?
In detail, it's cooperation really across the board, because if you're doing a digital transformation, at the end of the day, you're touching the entire supply chain. Everyone who has a role to play in the supply chain, from sourcing to to the supply chain, shipping your end product to the customer, there will be changes. And I think it's important to have the vision on how that will change at the end. But then you also need to narrow down the scope. I think in our case, for example, you mentioned maintenance. I would say the initial pilot, we decided at that time maintenance was not going to be the core focus. We were more focused on the quality part and the operations and energy. Those were some of the priorities at the time, more driven by the financial drivers at that time. But now maintenance is a topic that has resurfaced and has gotten a much higher priority. So I think that's also an important consideration. Yes, you need to think about all the different stakeholders that you need to work with, but no, you don't need to solve everything at once, because that's something that ultimately will take you way too much time and money to get to some initial results.
No, yeah, I agree. It has to be whatever, like what those incremental changes with maintenance will come after you already get the efficiencies in all those other areas. But I think at the beginning time, I love when you said you have to have a vision, you have to know where you go. Right. So if we want to go to Tokyo, I have to know if I'm starting in Italy or the US, right? It's a completely different path that I have to take to get there, but you still need to know where you're going to end up. So when we go back to even that MES discussion, I think a lot of people kind of select their platform on those initial core areas that they want to focus on. When you're talking about platform selection, are you looking to see that can it grow to the vision of the company, or are you linearly focused on will it address the needs of today?
I suppose you're then talking on selection, for example, of a solution like an MES platform.
Yeah, like any selection like that, right? Having like, do you approach it as, hey, I want to look to see if I could have a magic wand tomorrow and have everything will grow into this, but I still want something that's flexible that I can, modularly take on these initiatives as I grow, but not,
Yeah,
it only does these three things.
yeah. I think the strategy that we've applied, because we've done a selection of two times a platform. One was the MES project, and the other was to have a data platform to kind of go on top of MES and help us scale the predictive modeling. There's a couple of ways to go about it, but I think one, let's say, approach that we've used in both cases is to do some capability mapping, to really have a very thorough understanding. Once we are fully deployed, what are all the things that we want to be able to do? Starting from this end state vision, where do we want to go to? And then once we have and capabilities are things like, I want to be able to have energy management in a standardized way and compare that against benchmark data. That could be one capability. The other is obviously like performance management. So to really have a good idea of what are all the things I want to be able to do. And then we basically went on the market to go and compare all the different providers that have different solutions. That's one element. And obviously, what's also really important is to have then a good mapping. What are the capabilities that we have today that might sit in different platforms to really have a clear picture of the as is. But so understanding what is it that you want to be able to do, I think is a really important element in selecting the right platform. And I think it's something that I've in some cases seen being done kind of the other way around. There's like, there's a vendor that comes to somebody in the organization, says, hey, do you already have an MES system? And MES is able to do this, and this. And that's kind of where the project starts. It's really important to have a very good picture on what do we want to do, because maybe the solution might not be just an MES. Maybe you want to go broader. And like one example there is if you look at the MES landscape of the different kind of platforms, there's I would say two big branches in how they came about, because MES is really sitting in the middle between your ERP layer and your automation layer. And so there is some MES vendors that more grew out of the automation layer, and they, for example, tend to offer as part of their offering also a historian. While if you look at the MESs that come more from the ERP world, especially in discrete manufacturing, they're quite powerful. They tend to offer MESs without a historian. Now, if you have a capability that says, I want to be able to log time series data and do analytics on that, then that's something you really need to have crystal clear before you send out your tender, because otherwise you might end up with an MES system that doesn't work well together. And maybe your solution is to buy two components with different vendors. But if you haven't identified that up front, then you basically implement something only to learn that you miss some capabilities later on in the journey.
Great points.
Yeah, if I could add to that, what one of the things I see is that if you think of it from a system of systems perspective versus just a system, you could say that depending on how you envision your MES project, it could be just a system designed for execution on the plant floor, or it could be a system of systems where it's integrating. The top-down ERP tends to reflect more of the system of systems approach. And I don't know, what are your thoughts there, Bram? Because slapping the MES label can somewhat be misleading sometimes, because when you look at the problem.
Yeah, no, and it's indeed, it ultimately also comes down to the question on whether you want to have one single platform that handles all your capabilities, or whether you want to basically make systems work together. Now, I think the answer is quite obvious. You're not going to find any vendor, any platform that is able to handle everything. I mean, if you look at, because there is the term MES, which really stands typically for the MES, manufacturing execution capabilities. Then there is this broader term MOM, yep, which is more about manufacturing operations management. That goes more broad, can be about labor management. Maintenance solutions are often seen also as a separate solution. You have your ERP system, which also comes on the manufacturing shop floor. So you have already, as it is, a lot of systems. And one of the things that we've come across, and it's a question we often get from our operations as well, like, we want to get SAP or ERP system. We don't want to have that on the shop floor anymore. That's not a system for operations. But then you run into it's difficult to get everything eliminated. But I think the key or the solution is more into having sort of like a generic user interface, a user experience, where the applications that are brought to the front end are standardized, where as an operator you don't notice whether you're dealing with MES or maybe it's your maintenance application or ERP. There's a front end layer, preferably web-based and multi-device, so it doesn't matter on which device you run it. And then on the back end, all the complexity and all the systems, the system of systems is being handled. And I think that's what we're evolving to. I mean, you see that also with Aviva is focusing a lot now on like building solutions that are much more web native. And I think that's what we're going to see much more of in the future. And there was, for example, a period where low-code solutions were very popular. Not quite sure on how that will evolve going further, but the idea behind it's again having like a unified front end that handles the complexity, and then on the back end you have all systems that are specialized in what they're good at, and that's, I think, where the technology landscape seems to be evolving to.
So bringing all of this, back to data management and thinking about the to be state, the to be vision. You mentioned the need for a shift in thinking, right? So I think one of the terms in a previous conversation you had used, ideal data landscape. Would you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, so of course in the ideal data landscape, there's first of all you have a single source of truth of your data, and ideally we avoid copying our data over to multiple places. It sits there in one place. There's ownership, so the people who are producing the data can get access to that original data to make sure that, if there's a problem, they're the ones handling the issue. It needs to be scalable as well, so that you can, in an open way, communicate your data across the organization. That for me is the ideal landscape. For example, to give an example where the data landscape is far from ideal is when you have different cloud point solutions where parts of the data sit, but you cannot bring everything together to build one all-encompassing predictive model. And what it leads to is, what it needs to support is being able to bring a digital twin. If we have a representation of what the physical reality in the manufacturing state looks like, and there's some things that we are measuring, but maybe it's not available. There are things that we are not measuring yet. So all of these things need to come together But that's kind of where we need to go to really be able to build reliable predictive models on what is causing losses and waste and inefficiencies in production, so we can actually do something about it. So I think that's where we're aiming to. I think we're still quite a while away from that, because we started out from a lot of local historians, and for good reasons, because that's a good way to get ownership with our operations teams, and like if you look at a historian, that's where your automation team takes ownership. But then we started to realize, okay, if we want to build a predictive model on that data, we need to copy that data into a cloud platform. So I think that's where we are at right now. You get these enterprise solutions that bring data together from multiple sites, from multiple data sources, to scale your predictive modeling, and that is able to add. You need to run that in the cloud if you want to add resources to run huge models on large data sets. But then I think in the next phase, we can start to ask the question, do we still need those intermediate data sets on premise? I think today, for me, the answer is still yes, because it's an ownership question. I don't really see our automation engineers logging into our cloud platform to go and manage their data there. Not yet, but maybe in the future, because that was your question, what does the ideal data landscape look like? I think we need to find a solution for copying our data over and over, and I think that's something that still needs to be that needs to be solved.
David, do you have any thoughts on the ideal data landscape?
Well, it will, as Bram said, I'm seeing a shift from OT only towards more and more this IT focus. And that causes quite a lot of problems. Now, if we go back a couple of years, if you had I would say, a sensor data problem, you would go to an OT engineer. A process engineer would use an historian by default. But if you have a data problem today, a data question today, then typically IT owns that question. And why is that? That's just because how the world is changing, right? A data problem becomes a problem of the CIO, and thus the problem of data science team. And that means that we need to build a couple of different capabilities. One is we definitely still need data on the edge. Absolutely. We need data. We need data to stay there for local applications, for applications which are, I would say, need redundancy, low latency, etc. You also want to have edge compute capabilities, for example, to publish a local AI model. Let's take computer vision model, where you don't want to upload your camera data to the cloud, compute it over there, and then send the result back. No, you want probably low latency models, so you want to have that on the edge. And then we get into this kind of a gray zone where I would say more the traditional automation companies, they are still positioning an historian, a local historian, an enterprise historian, sometimes with some initial cloud capabilities to publish data to the cloud. And then you have a lot of startup companies in the OT data realm. And they are saying more and more like, yeah, no. Let's just keep the minimum amount of possible on the edge, and then we'll transfer that data into our cloud. I would say cloud first system. Then we start working over there. Now, I do see that this is it's something which is I would say it's immature, to say the least. Yes, you do see a lot of companies, you do see a lot of startups trying to solve part of the equation. Um, um, but it's still quite a lot of manual work. There are quite a lot of steps in between. When people need to use that data, they need to use different tools. They need, in many cases, to have some programming capabilities of their own. But nevertheless, we are changing toward becoming more and more cloud native. And that poses a lot of questions. One of the first question is obviously security and privacy of the data, data ownership. I already mentioned that. data governance is becoming more and more of a thing. Um, um, who takes the ownership? What about data quality? Um, do our applications sit? Do they only live in cloud systems? Do they still live on premise? How does that data gets synchronized back and forth? Where is the master of that data? Yeah, and then finally, how do these, I would say, OT data systems start combining themselves with IT first systems? The data lakes and the data warehouses IT has been using now for many, many, many years. And when you today log into Azure, and when you have a data engineer, a data scientist setting up data pipelines in Azure, running their models in Databricks or wherever they are working in. This is something where I feel that this domain is getting, I would say, it's maturing. It's maturing quite a lot. It's maturing very, very fast. On the other hand, in the OTs, I would say the OT data platforms, we still have quite some steps to take. And a lot of people, I would say, I have the feeling that today a lot of people try to, or whoops, there goes my ear, my earplug. Um, Today, a lot of people, I think they forget that there is still a big gap to bridge, to bring, I would say, to start working with OT data, sensor data, the same way we're used to working with IT first data.
What's
Maybe to
interesting is that hearing the two of you, and from a collaboration perspective, if we think of this as a set of design principles, and more importantly, Bram, design principles that are grounded in business value, right? So let's say there is a set of design principles, and you can say, some are non-negotiable, right? Design principles like, it's always a good idea to curate at source, because that's where the people have ownership, of the data. They know, what's, which data has integrity, etc. To have transparency, security, right? And then once, because there's always a set of trade-offs, right? Which principle, the different design principles may have different priorities by company. But then you bring that, once, you have, when it's aligned with the business strategy, then you can bring the data strategy side and say, okay, how do I make this happen from an architectural standpoint? Does that make sense what I said?
No, absolutely. And I think when thinking about the design principles and maybe also reflecting on the example that David gave earlier, I really like the idea of like, the OT combining with IT first systems, right? So what we, and I think of an example here. If you look at IT owns a data question, you'll have a data scientist who wants to make a predictive model on something that happens in the process. But that data that is being used to make that predictive model initially comes from your OT side. So you have, and all sorts of things might happen in operations that will require things to be done on your data source. You think about a temperature sensor. Something goes wrong and your maintenance engineer puts an offset or a recalibration in that sensor. When that instrumentation engineer has ownership and access to the data source and really uses that on a day-to-day basis, he'll make sure that the data is well curated and in a good shape. If you leave that ownership with the data scientist, then there's going to be at some point a disconnect. And what you're going to get then is, if you're running a predictive model, that data scientist will be discovering the offsets that was put in by your instrumentation engineer. And so you will introduce all sorts of problems with predictive models that are actually super obvious if you know what happened in the manufacturing environment. Mm-hmm. But we're kind of working then in two separate silos. So that's really why they really need to be, first of all, working closely together. You need to have your experts, the instrumentation, the process engineers, the people working close to the production process, and then the people analyzing the data working closely together in the same teams. But it's also about the ownership, and I think that's where if we have an IT first system where the OT teams do not show any ownership, then they're also not going to spend any time to validate the data. And that's a big problem for building qualitative models, which really needs to be solved in your design principles at first to really make sure that that you can get to meaningful conclusions at the end.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. These are all great points. This has been a fantastic discussion. I definitely appreciate everybody's input. I think, we learned a lot today. It seems like the more we talk about this, these problems become, pretty clear. So I think, there's a good framework here for where people need to focus, the considerations they need to make. How do you align on strategies? How do you convince stakeholders where to go? It'll be interesting to see how the podcast evolves and when we hear more and more stories. But I definitely want to thank Bram and David for their time today. And Bram, I wish you luck as you continue your recipe and blueprint with other customers out there, and hopefully help them scale their transformation initiatives as well. That's it for today of the Practitioners podcast. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Please make sure to leave your comments down below so we know where to take this thing moving forward. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.